Hello there, you're watching NDTV. I'm Maha Siddiqui. The friction in eastern Ladakh is now over 3 years old. The Chinese army personnel and ammunition in huge numbers continue to be at the LAC since the year 2020. India mirrored the move with its own deployment at the LAC. No de-escalation has happened since 2020, even though disengagement of troops has been achieved at least 3 friction points: the north and south banks of Pangong Lake, Gogra and Hot Springs. But there's been no de-escalation in 2 critical points, Depsang and Demchok. For over the last 1 year, China has in fact also been trying to downplay the severity of the friction, even as India said that bilateral ties were being overall impacted. In Johannesburg, on the sidelines of a BRICS meeting, NSA Ajit Doval has now used some strong words to convey the message to China that the situation has eroded the strategic trust and disrupted the political and public basis of the relationship as well. Where do India and China relations stand now, and where are they headed? And what message does the upping of this pressure on China now to disengage and then, in fact, continue with a de-escalation sent to Chinese President Xi Jinping a little over a month before the world leaders congregate in India for the G20 summit? That's our discussion this evening on NDTV. Let me now quickly introduce our guests who are joining us here on the show this evening. Brahmachalani, Strategic Affairs Expert, Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan, Member of the National Security Advisory Board, and Ambassador Prabhu former diplomat. We'll break the discussion down into 2 broad segments for better understanding by the viewers. Why has India decided to up the pressure on China at this juncture, and what could it mean in the run-up to the important summit to be held in India, G20, for which invites have been sent out to all the leaders, including Xi Jinping? General Narasimhan, I want to come first to you. Both Ajit Doval and Wang Yi, with whom he had a conversation in Johannesburg, are also the special representatives for boundary talks, which haven't happened since 2019. What do we make of this meeting in Johannesburg and the fact that Ajit Doval has used some strong words this time?
Good evening, Maha. Thanks for having me on the show. Firstly, I think the 2020 incidents have been actually an inflection point in the India-China relations, as we all know. The message that NSA has given has been a constant message since then being given to the Chinese side. Some time ago, even the PM mentioned about the bilateral relations will be dependent on what is happening on the border. Same was also said by our foreign minister. And so there's been a consistent stance that you see since 2020. And the reason why 2020 became an inflection point is because after 45 years, that is the first time that we actually lost casualties on the border. That is one. The second thing is, as it is a constant move by the Indian leadership, whether it is NSA or a foreign minister or the PM, there has been a constant approach towards the dealings with China. You talked about the de-escalation, the disengagement process, which is still 2 issues are pending with Depsang and Demchok, and thereafter the de-escalation has to take place. That is where we have hit a little bit of a roadblock, but the talks are still going on. So in the last meeting that the foreign ministers had, they also talked about resuming the military commanders talks. So there is some issue of making an effort towards towards seeing a result, as well as conveying the strong message that has been conveyed since 2020 in a constant manner by the entire leadership. That is the way I think we need to see this.
But Ambassador Prabhu, there have been at least 24 military and diplomatic talks that have been held since the friction started in eastern Ladakh. Why is this friction proving to be so complex that both diplomatic and military level talks are unable to resolve this situation?
Well, I think that the main reason why there are no real perceptible forward movements in regard to the talks with China in regard to the border is because of the Chinese intention. There is a huge difference between what Chinese leaders profess to be doing and wanting and what they actually do. For example, in his meeting with Mr. Doval, Wang Yi stressed that China does not seek hegemony. But in actual fact, China's entire policy is crafted towards territorial and economic expansionism. So China does not give up what it sees as its global interests, and it pursues a policy which is doublespeak. It does one thing and says that it is doing something else. I think that's the main reason why the distrust continues to grow and why our national security advisor had to tell Wang Yi that the situation along the LAC had eroded strategic trust and disrupted the public and political basis of the relationship. I don't think things are going to change so easily.
Okay. General Brahmachalani, General Narasimhan mentioned that there has been a consistent messaging from India that overall bilateral relations have been impacted by the situation in Eastern Ladakh, which has been communicated time and time again by External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. But when Ajit Doval uses words, as has been put out in the press release by the Indian side, that strategic trust has been eroded, do these words even matter for a country like China, as Prabhu Dayal is mentioning, which obviously has, ambitions? It has used hegemony in that region, in the neighboring countries as well, and it has an ambitious leader like Xi Jinping.
That's a very good question. The consistent messaging by New Delhi hasn't changed China in any way. This standoff with India is now about to enter the 40th month. And the risk of this confrontation escalating to intense bloody clashes or even unlimited border war can no longer be discounted given the large-scale forward military deployments by both sides. The fact is that China has been engaging in talks with India essentially to string India along while China creates more military infrastructure along the India frontier. That has been the Chinese strategy, to consolidate its hold on the encroached areas in Ladakh and to create new military infrastructure along the entire frontier with India. You mentioned that there are two outstanding areas, two so-called friction points. Actually, the entire Ladakh, eastern Ladakh frontier with Tibet is unsettled, because even where the buffer zones have come up, those buffer zones have come up largely on Indian territory. These buffer zones are temporary in nature. These buffer zones will remain until we have a process of disengagement, de-induction, and de-escalation. The only way to end this military standoff is through a deal to implement a sequential process of disengagement, de-escalation, and de-induction of rival forces. The details of such a deal can be hammered out only through military-to-military talks. The fact is that the Chinese are not willing to have such a deal, they're willing to only do piecemeal deals that favor them, that allow them to consolidate their hold on certain areas and allows China to mount greater pressure on India through new infrastructure development.
Okay. General Narasimhan, so 3 years down the line, do we have a better understanding of what China has been angling for all along with this friction? Because we have seen External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar say a couple of times that one could not really understand why this friction even started.
I fully agree with you. Before that, let me respond to a couple of things which came up during the other interventions. One is on the 24 talks have been held, etc. I mean, as far as I am concerned, the number of talks, the number of duration doesn't matter as long as we get what we want. So a case in point is Sundrungchu issue, where it took more than 7 years to actually resolve it in some form. So we shouldn't be worried about how much of time, how many talks, etc., etc. As long as we can keep pushing, I think that is the way we need to be going at. The second thing is on the other issue of, the question that whether our stance has changed China or not. The question is, it has changed our stance. The incident of 2020 has changed our stance. Before that, even in Dolan, when Dolan was happening in 2017, even though the border incident was happening, the other issues, the ministers were visiting, other issues were going on as normal. So that is brought in a change in us, whether it brought in a change in China or otherwise, that we need to keep pushing. But I think it has brought a change into ourselves. So coming to your question, can I have your question again, please?
So the question is that 3 years down the line, do we have a better understanding of why this friction even started? Why did China start this?
Right. It's extremely difficult to put a finger on exactly as to why they started it, because even our foreign minister has been on record saying that Chinese themselves have given a number of reasons as to why it started.
Yes.
The initial one was actually the infrastructure development that we are doing in the border area there. In addition to that, there are a number of other things that have happened. They have said themselves. So my own understanding has been, whatever has happened, what we need to be looking at is not to probably look at why it happened. Plus, we need to ensure that such a thing doesn't happen again. I think we should be concentrating more on that. And towards that effect, I think from the last 3 years, the amount of development that we have undertaken, both in terms of infrastructure, both in terms of organizational structures, both in terms of reorientation of forces, etc. I think that is the right way to go. And I think we have been on the right line as far as that is concerned. As far as the exact reason is concerned, it is going to be extremely difficult for anybody to pinpoint that.
Brahmacharani, even though the messaging from the Indian side has constantly been that the bilateral relations have been impacted, but the special representative level talks on boundary have not been held since 2019. That was the last time that the two leaders met on the issue of boundary itself. Why do you suppose that Ajit Doval and Wang Yi chose the sidelines of the BRICS meeting in Johannesburg to come face to face, talk this issue through, and also for Ajit Doval to at least increase the level of pressure that one would have otherwise thought? I mean, he's saying the same thing, but saying it more directly, that this has eroded strategic trust, that this has shaken the very basis of the relationship, political and public engagement. And this is just a little over a month before G20, where one would expect Xi Jinping to travel to India.
Well, first, this was a meeting in Johannesburg of the national security advisors of the BRICS countries. So when the NSAs meet, obviously they're going to be bilaterals. There had to be an India-China bilateral, and some statement had to be issued at the end of that meeting. The fact is that what Doval has said is nothing new, nor is it stronger than what Jaishankar has said or stronger than what Prime Minister Modi has said. The fact is, as General Narasimhan said, that the Indian messaging has been consistent. The fact is that India has locked horns with China by more than matching Chinese force deployments. No other country has taken on China militarily in this century the way India has done, not even the United States. Now, even at the risk of sparking a full-scale war, India is openly challenging Chinese power and capability through such a military standoff. But your previous question, why did China do it? Isn't that clear? Their main motive was to grab key strategic areas. They have changed the status quo along the eastern Ladakh region. They are now in a militarily stronger position vis-a-vis India. So we shouldn't be asking that question more than 3 years after the Chinese aggression began. But on the issue of border talks, let us not forget that these border talks began when Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India. They began in the early 1980s. Only the nomenclature keeps changing every now and then. It began as senior level talks, then became a joint working group, then became special representative talks. The fact is the Chinese have dragged India through decades of these futile talks without clarifying even the line of actual control. The LSE is not defined on the ground which makes these so-called border agreements that the two sides have concluded ineffective in terms of enforcement. This is the reason why the Chinese encroachments in eastern Ladakh happened in April 2020.
Okay. And does that then give the Chinese side some, loophole, if I may call it that way, in being able to change the ground realities? That's another question I'll take with General Narasimhan. But before that, I want to go across to Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, because we are just running some pictures there, old pictures of meetings between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping, one at the Sabarmati ashram just now. But the last time they exchanged pleasantries was in Bali, on the sidelines of the G20, a dinner hosted during the G20 summit. Now, when a host country, organizes a summit as big as G20, do we necessarily expect bilateral meetings with every other leader who is invited? And does that pose a tricky situation for India, considering that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping have not met bilaterally since the friction started?
Well, it is not mandatory in any sense to have a bilateral meeting with another member country on the sidelines of a multilateral meeting. We agree to have these meetings, or we seek to have these meetings when we want to, but we are not compelled to have these bilateral meetings. So there will be no compulsion whatsoever on any Indian leader to take part in a bilateral meeting with the Chinese if we don't want. Now, what are the Chinese really up to? Look, the Chinese are very consistent in pursuing their goal of global domination, of expanding their global profile, and in fact, overtaking the United States. Without doubt, the Chinese see India as a major obstacle, because they would rather have a much, much weaker neighborhood than they have at the moment. So they will do everything possible to put India down, whether it comes to blocking the designation as global terrorists of Pakistani terrorists like Sajjad Mir, or engaging in a sort of a relationship with Pakistan which is meant only to trouble India as much as possible. Because without doubt, China wants to put India down, keep India down, have India engaged in lots of bilateral disputes with all the neighbors, so that it can pursue its own global ambitions, and in any case, its ambitions of being the biggest power of the region.
Prabhu Dayal, but I just want to ask this question again to you, because a little over a month later, we'll be seeing probably Xi Jinping, since an invitation has been sent out to all the G20 members, to be in India. If PM Modi meets with all other leaders, say, some of the prominent leaders bilaterally, what scenario is likely to play out, considering that you said it's not mandatory to have a bilateral meeting, but India is the host country? How does then this play out? Does it appear that the friction is bigger than what it is, or will India be sending out the right message by not holding that bilateral meeting?
No. Let me put it differently. To engage with other member countries at the multilateral setting is an obligation. India would be inviting the other G20 leaders to the summit, and it will be engaging with them in the multilateral setting. However, there is no obligation whatsoever on India as host country to have bilateral meetings with the other members. If we want to have a bilateral meeting, and if the Chinese are also wanting to have one, certainly that will be arranged. But if either side is not willing, then no such bilateral meeting has to take place.
All right.
That is
okay. Last question, General Narasimhan, to you. As Brahmachalani there mentioned, would you say that China is trying to create new ground realities, even as the boundary question is up in the air?
I'll go along with Dr. Brahmachalani as he said. See, all along, we have also been saying in the last 3 years, all our leaders have been saying that China has tried to change the status quo on the line of actual control in a unilateral manner, which is not only happening here. Dr. Brahmacharani mentioned about Eastern Ladakh. We should also be careful about the middle sector and the eastern sector, where again pressure could come up in some form or the other. The issue is that till the time the LAC clarification takes place, as he explained, we had changed the maps in the middle sector, but we couldn't change the maps beyond that. Until the time the LAC clarification takes place, we need to be extremely careful on all along the border. And in the three-step process that we talked about, the last step was to ensure that there is no unilateral effort to change the status quo on the line of actual control is something that we need to ensure. Okay. So that is the way we need to be looking at. And I agree with him that there was an effort to change this status quo on the line of actual control unilaterally in Eastern Ladakh, and we need to be careful not only there but all along the entire line of actual control.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Many thanks to all three of our panelists for joining us here on this discussion this evening.